All right, APUSH students, get ready to dive into the most dramatic chapter of early American history, where we go from colonies to revolution and lay the foundation of the United States. Think you know the story? Let's find out. If you've seen Hamilton, you've heard the hype about Alexander Hamilton, George Washington, and Thomas Jefferson, but today we'll break down the real battles, politics, and decisions that changed the course of history between 1754 and 1800. Grab your notes, because this is the moment where the colonies go from not throwing away their shot to shaping a nation. This is Wendy with AP History Help, and this is the AP History Help podcast, where you will learn everything you need to know about taking AP History classes. From skills to content, from historical thinking skills to themes in history. Whether you're taking or thinking about taking AP World History, AP US History, or AP European History, this podcast is for you. Be sure to check out the episode list and the show notes to find the topics that you need help with. AP History Help is on TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube, where I am happy to answer your questions. As you should be well aware by now, last year in season 1 of the podcast, I covered the skills and the themes of AP history classes. This season, we are now 6 episodes in, and you should have figured out that we are covering content back and forth each episode from AP World to APUSH and back. AP Euro kiddos, while your content will come next season, with the exception for the hurricane that knocked out power and threw me off my routine, I have been trying to release at least one video each week on Sundays on my social media channels, TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube. That is a clip that's specifically geared to AP European history. And you'll see some interactions in the comments, so essentially proof that I do answer the questions you ask. In addition, you can find the self-paced AP European enrichment courses that I offer on OutSchool in the show notes. Real quick, I had to leave some stuff out of the podcast. I've come to realize that I just don't have the time to cover it all, but have no fear. In the show notes are links to connect with me for tutoring or even take a self-paced or live class on the parts of the Constitution that I didn't cover. Be sure to check them out. Okay, now on to today's episode. Today, students, I will be teaching you about Unit 3 of AP US History. I've said this before, but I'm going to keep saying it because the episodes this season are content-based. I would strongly recommend taking notes. There's a lot of ways to do that, but my recommendation is to do so thematically. I want you to focus especially on the social, political, economic, cultural, and technological events and trends. Your best bet would be to have a copy of my Student Success Planner available through Amazon or from me by mail. I'll drop the link in the show notes to my website, which gives you the option to buy it either way. Oh, or you could go to my TikTok shop and buy it there. Find me at AP History Help. But at the very least, listen with a pen and a piece of paper. There will be a lot to learn today. Come in, students. Let's get this episode of AP History Help started. First, get your notes out. Our topic for today is the period from 1754 to 1800. We will look at what led to the Revolutionary War and its aftermath. To put Unit 3 in context, you really should go back and listen to episode 26 for the full story. But briefly, late in the 17th century, a series of wars were fought involving Great Britain, France, and Spain. They were worldwide in scope, with battles in Europe and India and in North America. And they often involved other Europeans as well as the natives of India and North America. The stakes were high for power in Europe and for control of the colonies and their lucrative trade. In North America, the most valuable possessions were sugar-producing islands in the Caribbean Sea and fur trading networks with the American Indians in the interior of North America. All three European countries had claims in North America. The Spanish in present-day Florida and Mexico, the French mostly west of the Mississippi and into present-day Canada, and the British claimed the eastern seaboard as well as central Canada. France and Britain had a series of wars overseas, but the last of these, the 7 Years' War, began in North America in 1754. Because American Indians were heavily involved in defending their interests and most allied with the French, this event is also known as the French and Indian War. Thus begins period 3. Can you guess what defines the end? Keep listening. There are 3 big ideas or key concepts for period 3. First, the British attempts to assert tighter control over its North American colonies and the colonial resolve to pursue self-government led to a colonial independence movement and the Revolutionary War. Second, the American Revolution's democratic and republican ideals inspired new experiments with different forms of government. And third, migration within North America and competition over resources, boundaries, and trade intensified conflicts among peoples and nations. Everything I'm covering today will connect to one or more of those ideas, so pay attention. As I mentioned before, the British and French went toe-to-toe in the French and Indian, or 7 Years' War. Its beginning defines period 3, 1754. It was fought between the French Canadians and their native allies and the British and their allies. The French started it, or provoked it, by building a chain of forts in the Ohio River Valley, trying to stop the British and extending their colonial power further west. A young George Washington was tasked with stopping the French from completing work on Fort Duquesne in what is now Pittsburgh. Despite a small victory, Washington and his troops surrendered to the French on July 3rd, 1754, marking the start of this war. Another future patriot, Benjamin Franklin, also played a key role in this conflict. The British government called together representatives from several colonies to meet in Albany, New York, and figure out how to work together to coordinate colonial defenses. The agreement was drawn up by Franklin and called for a system of recruiting troops and collecting taxes for common defense. Unfortunately, it failed, due to each colony more concerned about their own taxation power. But it was significant because it set a precedent for later, more revolutionary Congresses in the 1770s. If you've seen that famous image of cut-up snake that says "join or die," that is in reference to the Albany Plan of Union, not to future attempts at independence. The war would end in 1763 with a British victory and marked a turning point in the control of North America. The Treaty of Paris meant that France gave up all of its lands in North America, and Spain had to give up Florida to Britain as well. Great Britain became supreme among Europeans on the continent. The war challenged American Indian autonomy, established Britain as a world naval power, and it meant that the colonies no longer had to fear attacks from the French, the Spanish, or their Native American allies. Key, though, is how the British and colonists viewed each other. The British saw the colonists as untrained and unable and unwilling to defend the new frontiers of the expanded British Empire. Whereas the colonists saw things differently. They were proud of how they had done things and weren't exactly happy with the British troops or leadership, not to mention their strategy fighting in the wooded areas of eastern North America. Now, the Native Americans weren't exactly thrilled. They lost a valuable trading partner in France, and the colonists started moving into the territory that used to belong to the French. So in 1763, Ottawa Chief Pontiac created a confederation that started to attack frontier forts and settlements from Virginia to New York, leading to 2,000 colonists killed or captured. The British, in response, sent British troops, not wanting to rely on colonial forces, and they distributed blankets intentionally infected with smallpox to the Indians, and eventually the rebellion and many Indians died out. To prevent further problems, King George draws a line called the Proclamation Line of 1763 that forbids settlement west of the Appalachians, to leave the land for the Native Americans. This would save the British money, prevent Indian trouble, and keep the colonists to the east better tied to their mother country. Now, the colonists, they were outraged and moved west in defiance, figuring the British couldn't stop them. The British were really getting ticked off. They spent a lot of money fighting wars, and the colonists were becoming difficult and expensive. They saw that it was time to assume direct control and enforce the Navigation Acts, ending the long period of salutatory neglect. In the next years to follow, we see a series of actions and reactions. After the proclamation of 1763, the colonists became, in the words of John Adams, more attentive to their liberties, wanting to have representation in Parliament. To make matters worse, the British passed a series of acts taxing sugar and paper, legal documents, newspapers, as well as requiring the colonists to provide food and living quarters for the British soldiers in the colonies. In 1765, in response to the Stamp Act, we hear Patrick Henry utter the words, "Taxation without representation is tyranny," along with many others who would eventually form the Stamp Act Congress, resolving that only their elected representatives had the legal authority to approve taxes. The colonists formed a secret society to intimidate tax agents called the Sons and Daughters of Liberty, often going so far as to tar and feather the guys collecting the taxes. There were also boycotts of British imports. The Stamp Act was finally repealed a year after it was enacted, but it was replaced by the Declaratory Act, stating that Parliament could tax the colonists whenever and however it wanted. The very next year, the Townshend Acts were tariffs placed on colonial imports of tea, glass, and paper, as well as allowing British officials to search private homes for smuggled goods with no true warrant. Over the next few years, we see grassroots efforts at protest and organization coming from Pennsylvania and Massachusetts. Colonists stepped up their boycotts of British goods, and merchants increased their smuggling. Many of the taxes were repealed, except for that one on tea. But in March of 1770, a crowd of colonists in Boston harassed guards at the customs house, leading the guards to fire into the crowd, killing 5 people. This tragedy would be used to inflame the anti-British feelings amongst the colonists. Meanwhile, tea is still being taxed, and the colonists are refusing to buy it. So Parliament passed the Tea Act in 1773, making their tea cheaper than what colonists were paying for smuggled tea. It didn't matter. They weren't buying what the British were taxing. And in 1773, disguised as American Indians, a group of Bostonians boarded British ships and dumped out hundreds of chests of tea into the harbor. The famous Boston Tea Party that led the British to retaliate with the Intolerable Acts, a series of actions and restrictions that basically equated to the straw that broke the camel's back. Violence increased, and enough people spoke out publicly, participating in mass protests as the movement for independence grew stronger. A convention was called for in Philadelphia, later to be called the First Continental Congress. Without getting into detail, you really should know some of the men there and what they did. They adopted 3 measures essentially asking the British to repeal the intolerable acts, ask the king to make right their grievances, and created committees. If the measures weren't addressed, they would meet again 7 months later. The king's government was like, nope, and sent troops to put down the disorder in Massachusetts, who they saw as in rebellion. These violent clashes would be the first battles of the Revolution, Lexington and Concord, and Bunker Hill. As promised, the delegates reconvened a month after the fighting had begun at the Second Continental Congress, where the foundation was laid for the writing of the Declaration of Independence. This iconic document listed specific grievances against the king, as well as the words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." War and independence. The British had far more resources, a bigger population, and a strong, wealthy economy. Their army was well trained and their navy was the best in the world. The Patriots were mostly from New England and Virginia, and many didn't want to leave their own regions. The troops were chronically low on supplies, poorly equipped, and rarely paid. But they had more skin in the game. This was their home, their lives, their battles. They had a much larger stake and more resiliency. Not all colonists supported the revolution. About 60,000 of them, we call them Tories, supported and fought for the British, often dividing families. American Indians tried to stay neutral, but after attacks by the colonists, they supported the British. Washington's troops were not doing well for the first 3 years. It looked bleak. But in 1777, after America won the Battle of Saratoga, France's king, Louis XVI, openly allied itself with the Americans. Spain and Holland would join the following year. In 1781, at Yorktown, Virginia, the British would surrender to George Washington, and the Treaty of Paris would officially end the Revolutionary War. The Articles of Confederation, it was the plan of government written by the Second Continental Congress during the war, establishing America as a confederation. States had autonomy with their own constitutions. White males with property could vote. It dealt with how new states would be added from territories. But there were weaknesses that quickly became apparent. Many of those were the result of what we didn't like about the British. We didn't like taxation without representation, so the federal government couldn't tax. We didn't like the king with all the power, so there was no president or even executive branch. Heck, there wasn't even a national court system. We didn't like that the colonies had to listen to the king, so with the Articles, states didn't have to follow the laws and treaties or follow other states' laws. And if anything were going to be changed, it required a unanimous vote of all of the states. In addition to that, the post-war economy was in trouble. War debts, a depression, a lack of currency, foreclosures, and more plagued America. And maybe you know by now, when the economy is bad, people are unhappy. Some farmers in western Massachusetts refused to pay taxes and protested in what was called Shays' Rebellion, storming an arsenal for weapons. The federal troops couldn't help. This showed the weakness of the federal government and the Articles of Confederation. And on top of all of that, most people still saw themselves as Virginians or South Carolinians rather than Americans. So in May 1787, 55 delegates attended the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. Initially, they were going to fix the Articles, but quickly realized they just needed to scrap it and start over. I don't have time to cover all of the details, but the Constitution provided a federal system of government with shared power between the states and the national government, and a separation of powers into 3 branches that all check and balance each other so that no one branch has too much power. Compromises had to be made. like the Great Compromise, establishing two legislative houses, one based on population and the other with equal representation for each state. The Three-Fifths Compromise dealt with how to count slaves for purposes of taxing and determining representation in Congress. There were other dealings with trade and how the president would be elected as well. Once it was written, there were still debates and controversies. Some felt that it was great. They were the Federalists, promoting a strong federal or national government. They wrote essays called the Federalist Papers. The majority, penned by Alexander Hamilton. Others felt that the Constitution didn't protect individual or states' rights enough. 10 amendments, known as the Bill of Rights, were eventually added, and everyone, well, almost everyone, was happy. The Constitution was officially ratified in 1791, 4 years after the original was finished. Oh, I totally just left so much out about the Constitution, but I do have one-on-one tutoring available, as well as a class called The Living Constitution that gets pretty deep into not just the structure and function, but all the way through the amendments. Plus, it also ties into how the Constitution is alive and well today. Check that out in the show notes for a link with more information. Anyway, the Constitution is written. And America is young, but it's growing quickly. The population is doubling every 25 years. 90% of the people lived on farms, and the public debt was getting pretty big for such a young country. Not to mention that Great Britain and Spain threatened the fragile unity of the United States. But we had a president unanimously elected by the Electoral College in 1789, and he was ready to lead. Despite nothing about it in the Constitution, he appointed a cabinet of 4 advisors. Thomas Jefferson was his Secretary of State, dealing with foreign matters. Alexander Hamilton was Secretary of the Treasury. Henry Knox was the Secretary of War. And Edmund Jennings Randolph became the first Attorney General. As we saw in Hamilton, he and Thomas Jefferson went head-to-head on many issues. Hamilton being more of a Federalist and Jefferson being more siding with powers given to the states or the people. This big disagreement was over a national bank and whether there should be one. But as a young country just figuring out who it was and how it would be run, there would be many disagreements. One example is what's known as the Whiskey Rebellion. In the southwest part of Pennsylvania, in the backcountry, they were pretty hard hit by excise taxes. So the Whiskey Boys torched buildings, tarred and feathered tax collectors, and talked of secession. President Washington summoned militia of several states, about 13,000 of them, and they were escorted by George Washington and Alexander Hamilton themselves. This was significant because it was the first display of federal government ensuring domestic tranquility. But Jeffersonians condemned the action as a brutal display of force, and they gained more followers from the people who agreed with them. Meanwhile, Native Americans found themselves losing conflicts with the settlers and were either forced to live on reservations or migrate west. The government enacted laws and treaties, but the settlers themselves often disregarded them, getting into conflicts with the American Indians. And when that happened, the government would side with the settlers. As the country grew and makes decisions on many issues, 2 political parties began to emerge. The Federalists, which were not the same as the Federalists who supported the Constitution, although they had some views in common, and the Democratic Republicans. The Federalists believed in rule by the elite, distrusting the common people. They were all for encouraging business but not getting involved, and were pro-British in their foreign policy. Hamilton was a Federalist. The Democratic Republicans advocated for rule of the people, believing that the masses could be taught and could rule. They appealed to the middle class and believed that the government that governed best governed least. And they were for free speech, and they were basically pro-French. Washington tried to resolve these conflicts, though he was a Federalist, he grew tired of the verbal abuse from Jefferson, and he figured 2 terms, it was enough. He wrote a farewell address to the American people, warning them of the evils of political parties, the danger of entangling alliances, and to a large extent, isolationism would become the dominant foreign policy for the next 100 years. Washington is known as setting a number of precedents: a 2-term presidency, not to be challenged until Franklin Roosevelt, and creating his own cabinet of advisors were chief among those precedents. We don't have time to talk about a number of the early treaties and resolutions or John Adams' presidency, but I wanted to end this episode with the year that defines the end of this period, 1800. In the election of 1800, John Adams ran against Thomas Jefferson, a rematch of the 1796 election. The result would be victory for Jefferson and the first peaceful and orderly transfer of power from one political party to another. A beautiful example of American democracy at its finest. The desire of the politician bowing to the will of the people, an honored tradition that would stand true until 2021. But that's not part of the APUSH curriculum yet. Next episode, which will be released in 2 weeks, on November 4th, the day before Election Day, will be for Unit 4 of World History, which covers transoceanic interconnections from 1450 to 1750. And just 2 weeks after that, on November 18th, you will be ready for Unit 4 of APUSH, covering the period from 1800, where we're leaving off, to 1848. A seemingly boring time in American history. I mean, what even happened between the Revolutionary War and the Civil War? Yeah, boring. Yeah, boring if you think that being a teenager is boring. Lots of learning and growing and confusion. If you haven't already done so, get that student success planner from my website, from Amazon, or from TikTok. Head on over to my website, aphistoryhelp.com, where you will see a bunch of ways to contact me. Feel free to do so with any questions you might have. I am here to help you. And that will do it for this episode. Don't forget to come back to Wendy for AP History Help. And this episode of the AP History Help podcast is now history.